Hello, I'm Graham Smith.
And I'm Abby Tarttelin.
And this is From Below the Balcony, the Republic podcast.
Today we'll be talking fake history, Republican history in the UK being related to royalty, and why people don't react to murderous monarchs the way they react to other bastards. Join, donate, get involved, buy merch at republic.org.uk. This episode will be going out on YouTube, all your favourite podcast platforms, and on Patreon, where you can join us for analysis, chat, and some extras. So find us at republic.org.uk/Patreon.
And in this episode, we are joined by Andrew Scott, aka Otto English, author and journalist and commentator and playwright, I believe.
Once upon a time.
And of course, I found your blog. That was good.
Oh, did you?
Yeah.
Blogger,
It's interesting reading.
Podcast.
Anything, really.
In eternally shifting sands.
Yes. Yeah. And obviously also these two brilliant books, Fake History and Fake Heroes. And of course, the whole notion of fakery, fake news and all the rest of it has become quite a big issue in recent years. But it's particularly interesting for me because fake history and fake heroes is what the monarchy is. I mean, it is the biggest load of fakery there is, really. There's very little of it which is accurate and true. And I guess in my book, I talked about the monarchs as being dictators, but we dress them up in fancy robes and give them royal title, sort of religious connotations. But you talk about them as being sort of the Don Corleone and Al Capones of history. What does that mean?
Yeah, I mean, it depends what period you're talking about. But if you're going back to the 15th, 16th century, most certainly they were akin to gangsters. I think that it's a good analogy. So if you take Henry V, who we were talking about just before we started, actually. So Henry V, much loved, played by Timothy Chalamet, played by Kenneth Branagh, played by Laurence Olivier, and everybody knows the story of Hal and Falstaff. So you get this lovely origin myth into the bargain as told by Shakespeare. And people like that are so sort of rooted and entrenched in our broader popular culture that we never pause to think about whether that is actually who Henry V was or whether this is some sort of cartoonish version of who Henry V was, and that we've all ended up believing the cartoon over the actual person. And in the case of Henry V, it doesn't take much digging into the actual story of Henry V to find a megalomaniacal lunatic, essentially, who invades. I mean, when I was a child, I studied Henry IV Part 1 and Part 2 for my O-level. That's how old I am. And then I remember watching Henry V and the invasion of France and Harfleur and once more to the breach, dear friends, and all that kind of stuff. But you never sort of pause to think, why is he actually doing that?
Yeah.
And when you dig into why he was actually doing that, he was doing it because he believed that through his great-grandfather and great-great-grandfather, in fact, his great-grandfather had never ruled France or any part of France, he had some sort of divine inherited right to own large regions of France. Now, as I say in Fake Heroes, there's not much difference between that and Putin.
Yeah. So let's talk about Henry V, because you have a whole chapter about him in your book on Fake Heroes.
Yeah.
Now, I thought, okay, like I know the real history personally of Henry V, or the real, in my mind, this kind of the myth that you're talking about. But I thought it'd be interesting to see what people are saying online about Henry. And so I just did a quick Google. Wikipedia say he had outstanding military successes and he made England one of the strongest military powers in Europe. Now, I think I remember from your chapter that the gains he made were quickly lost.
Yeah.
And then Smithsonian says his reign saw a flourishing of royal authority and military action. The BBC calls him a great warrior king, and the royal say he was a brilliant general.
Yeah.
Can you tell us the real story of Agincourt and this kind of military success? Because the interesting thing as well was, as you say, it seems like this expansion was something that's just seen as for good.
Yeah.
But in fact, to me, your chapter read like some young man who decided he was going to go be, I'm going to be, put it mildly, be quite the arse in a country that wasn't his own.
Yeah. I mean, let's return to the Putin analogy. Putin believes that he has, or Russia has, a historic right to rule Ukraine. Now, it's not quite the same because, of course, France was a very powerful country in the 16th century. So, 15th, sorry. It was very much more powerful. But Putin believes he has that right to take that land. Henry somehow believed he had the right to take back France. So he goes over to France. He lays siege to Harfleur. He's successful. That's the once more into the breach, dear friends bit. But then that episode ends with him driving all the women and children from the city and slaughter. It's a massacre. It's a war crime, essentially. Then through the whole debacle, he's obliged, and illness coming into his army, he's basically obliged to flee to the coast. And it's on that journey. So it's not, all of this has played out over a period of weeks. It's on the journey back towards the coast that he gets basically caught up in a bottleneck at Agincourt and is obliged to stand and fight the French. Now, again, according to the sort of popular history narrative, he's outnumbered, he's a man of the people, he goes among his troops the night before, he listens in on their conversations. You get that throughout history. Kings going among their people like an ordinary guy. You know, you get it with Charles II. Just he loved to hang out with the ordinary people. You didn't like to hang out with the ordinary people. Anyway,
what a nice man.
What a nice man.
Can you be talking to a pleb? How lovely of him.
In truth, at least according to the chroniclers, we know that Henry V threatened to cut the ears off anybody who spoke in camp the night before Agincourt.
Yeah, they had to be completely silent. Was that right?
So the notion that he's wandering around campfires and chatting to the ordinary soldiers isn't true. He'd actually threatened to cut their ears off. Agincourt does play out much as it does in the Shakespeare play. The weather and the heavily armed French cavalry are unlucky.
Because they're in mud.
They're in
right?
mud.
They're in mud. And also Henry's forces are very archer heavy.
Archer heavy, light on their foot.
And they bring defensive battlements,
if you want to be a sort of military geek, he plays a good battle. Yeah?
Let's be military geeks.
He plays a good battle. But right in the middle of the battle, and again for reasons that people aren't entirely certain about, he suddenly becomes paranoid about the prisoners and the hostages he has, and he slits all their throats.
So can we zoom in on that and just sort of play it back, rewind? Because that is, quickly said and an enormous thing.
It is,
It's really was interesting. We were talking about it before we came in to record today, that you hear a line like that in a history book. And I think, especially because it sort of seems a weird thing to be giving children history books with any information like that. Obviously, most people don't know that particular act, but there's lots of things that I read in history books, like horrible histories about slaughter and maiming and, being hung, drawn and quartered, that you almost think as a child is like, oh, cool, that's interesting. And it's weird that we give kids stories like that. But I just wanted to sort of punch in and ask exactly what happened. And what were the rules of engagement in those days? Were if you had prisoners, were you not supposed to kill them all?
So there's my favourite phrase in both these books is even by the standards of the day, right? So if something is shocking, even by the standards of the day, when you're talking about the 1400s, that's fairly shocking. Yeah. So
was it not like a really great time for equality and civil rights and stuff? No, it was like...
I mean, it's the same actually with Churchill, but when people talk about his attitude to certain things in the 1920s, empire, for example, Churchill's attitude to empire, even by the standards of the day, Churchill was a bit of an empire loon. And even by the standards of his day, Henry V was behaving in a cruel and violent manner towards the prisoners and hostages he had. It was an outrage. And what's interesting is Shakespeare put that detail in his play, which is, I think, really interesting. But I think in the Laurence Olivier version, they cut it out.
That's
this is commonplace, because I remember reading about Charlemagne, who people talk about as this grand emperor who sort of built modern Europe and expanded his empire across and brought Christianity to lots of parts of Eastern Europe as well. But he attacked the Saxons, was defeated. So the next year he went back, defeated them, rounded up 4,000 of them and executed them. They'd already been defeated. They were his prisoners, but he executed 4,000 men just because he was annoyed that they defeated them the year before. And it's that kind of barbarity, which I imagine that even, as you said, by the standard of the day, other people wouldn't have done that.
Yeah. In my next book, actually, I've got a chapter on Vlad the Impaler, Dracula, the real Dracula. And I pitched him into the book because I thought, the interesting character, what's the true story? And as I went on researching him, I just thought, this is just a truly appalling human being. There's no dressing this up. You know, going around impaling people and babies and women on huge, sticks.
I didn't even know there was a real
Dracula. Vlad Dracula. Well, Dracula is son of Dracul, and his father was Dracul the Dragon. So
for his mild temperament.
Actually, it was Dracul the Dragon was given it as an honorific title by the Holy Roman Emperor. Well, let's not diverge down that path.
I mean, the history of the popes is a whole other thing. It's absolutely fascinating. But the connection between them and the royalty and the emperor and the whole notion of emperors, which still goes back to Roman times. But I think for me, one of the things that I try and do with this history is sort of what I would call secularize it. So take away the royal language and the religious language, and you do have just a long string of murderous bastards. And this
kind of
idea
trying to
that
seize other people's land
and people will say,
women
well,
and
that was
children in
how
the process.
people say, well, that's how things were back then. It's like, well, no, but there were other places where they were trying democracy. There were other places when they were trying it, 3,000 years ago.
Also, you can say that is how things were back then. I think that's a fair enough argument. It's fair enough. But you can also say, should we really be glorifying these people?
Yes, we should be celebrating the fact that we've escaped.
So this is the problem. It's that you can just say, oh yeah, well that's just what they did. Fine, you could say that about Putin. You could say that about Stalin. You could say that about Hitler. But we shouldn't be glorifying those people. So I don't think we should be glorifying these other people either.
And it comes right up to the modern day, because I know that I talked about racism in the royal family in more recent times, and the fact that they excuse themselves from race discrimination laws in the workplace back in the early 70s, and people excused it, saying, well, that was the attitude of the day. I thought, well, it wasn't the attitude of all the MPs that were passing that legislation. It wasn't the attitude of all the people that were campaigning against racism. So, and yet these are the people that you're excusing them as if they are just ordinary people, but you're also elevating them to this special position.
And thinking of past times, we have the Vikings, who everybody thinks of as murderous bastards. But it seems like Henry V and other monarchs that you talk about, you talk about Henry VIII as Stalin, were doing similar stuff. But why don't people react to monarchs the way they react to other bastards?
So this is what I call, in my first book, Ladybird Libertarian History. And older listeners will remember the Ladybird series of books. I get into trouble for saying this because there are a lot of people who love Ladybird books. In fact, as a child, I loved Ladybird books, and I still like the pictures.
Read a lot.
But the trouble is, we forge narratives about ourselves. We forge narratives about ourselves as individuals. We forge narratives about our friendship groups. We forge narratives about our families. And we forge narratives about ourselves as nations. And central to the UK's identity is this notion of our kings and queens. Now, if you start to investigate almost any of them, of course, they're human beings. And also, in their defence, most of them are born into it and don't really have much choice over it. I mean, the women, for example, in the royal narratives, are basically obliged to have children. That's it. And even if you become a queen regnant, a queen in your own right, you are still obliged, that's your role, to provide another heir. So it's a sort of, it's an extremely self-destructive and cancerous setup, really, because it's obliging people to keep forging this narrative of a sort of continuing line of monarchs doing good and all this kind of stuff. I've forgotten what your original question was. I got so cross about it.
Why do people... we like passion here. Yeah. So why do people let monarchy off? In the way that they don't let other people off? Because it's the
wallpaper of life. It's the wallpaper of the nation.
Right.
People can't imagine of a world in which we don't have the monarchy. And if you start saying that to people, if you're incredibly reasonable about it and say, come on, this is like a hangover from the medieval and older periods in history, we really need to... what other things in life would you be persisting with that existed 1,000 years ago just because you've always had them? Would you have a toilet that you kept for 1,000 years, or like a? These things are so part and parcel of our lives that the British people can't. Many British people cannot imagine of another world without them. And when you do suggest it, people will go, oh, but then you'll just have President Blair or President Farage, or I don't want President Farage or President Blair, because even the very basic things, like how you would have a presidency and how you would have a republic, most people in this country, I mean, this is a huge generalization, but I'm going to say it anyway, most people in this country just don't understand it. They don't understand that you can have different types of president, that you don't, you can have non-executive and executive presidents.
I was doing a debate back during lockdown, I think it was, over Zoom, and there was I won't say who it was, but there was a historian and royal commentator, one of these people that gets trotted out all the time. But he wasn't one of the worst sort of flag-waving royal commentators. He was an intelligent guy, but I just said at one point about how they do it in Ireland. Just very, sort of potted explanation of, parliamentary system, elect a head of state, they got very limited role, etc. And he said, well, yeah, I'd not really thought about that. That sounds fine to me. And I thought, well, how are you spending so much time defending the monarchy if you haven't even understood what the alternative is?
Yes.
You're defending it, saying this is a great system without knowing what else is on offer. It's very odd.
Was his name Charles? Because our problems could be over.
No. As you... No, I'm related to Henry V.
Yes.
And we talk about this, or you talk about this in your book. And I've had this debate.
And Charlemagne.
And Charlemagne. Yeah. Everybody is, of course. And this is quite interesting because this is notion that you pick up on about this. And I noticed on the royal website, the official royal website, they list all the kings and queens only going back to 1066. Yeah. And there's this curious notion that there's this unbroken line of a very distinctly identifiable family. And I did a debate a long time ago, and there's someone, I think it was an aristocrat, suggesting that, some of these people are from the oldest families in Europe. It's like, we're all the same age.
Yes.
All our families are connected.
Yeah, the oldest family is such a stupid notion. Right, this is what triggers me. In fact, this is why I'm a Republican. The class system is a disease, and it should long ago have been eradicated. It should have gone the way of historic diseases that we no longer have to put up with. And that really is the reason that I'm a Republican. It still infuses so much of our life and our politics in this country.
You talk a bit about the aristocracy being this very small, odd...
yes, small and odd, yes. And yet, people like Jacob Rees, anybody can become an aristocrat. Yeah. You just put on the airs and graces and wait a generation. I mean, that's all that happens. So the likes of Jacob Rees, I think one of Jacob Rees-Mogg's grandfathers was either a coal miner or a truck driver.
Yes. Wow.
But that bit is edited out because this is what I call the fake family saga. You edit that bit out and then you start talking about how your ancestors came over with William the Conqueror, right?
I really want to ask, I feel like when you said, you just wait a generation, I thought, really? I've never thought about it, but what is the aristocracy?
Well, exactly. So in North, I mean, what is it? What is it? It's a load of self-styled poshos who look down on the rest of the world and who have decided. I mean, I don't even like the term posho because it's giving them a respect they don't deserve. People who believe themselves to be, in no other part of society would we allow someone to believe that they are intrinsically better than anybody else purely by dint of their birth. It's insane. And yet this country continues to go along with it.
I think you said that there's a small group of people that are preoccupied by affectation.
Yeah.
Because it all seems to be so fake, including, they've got all these notions of how to pronounce words and how to speak and how, what cutlery to use at the dinner table. It's all about setting themselves apart from everybody else. It's like, well, we're in this little club. You're not, because you don't understand these things.
So the whole you and non-you thing, which the Mitford, Nancy Mitford, I think was it Nancy? Yes, the Mitford sisters. This notion of you and non-you language, upper class language and non-upper class language.
Right.
So, do you say napkin or do you say serviette? And through these codes of language, you can identify whether somebody has got good breeding or whether that person is from the lower middle classes or the working class, right? Now, everybody, when you talk about you and non-you, people go, oh, it was a joke. She was just having a joke. Nancy was just having a joke about that. No, she wasn't. She was propping it up. And I knew, I mean, I went to boarding school. I spent my youth mixing with people like this. Those people used the correct language. And if somebody said serviette instead of napkin, some people are aghast. Some people think that these old families, so-called, have got some hereditary and inherent right to be better than the rest of us. But of course, and as you identified earlier, we're all descended from monarchs. Yeah. So Danny Dyer goes on Who Do You Think You Are? And discovers he's a descendant of Edward III. That's great. Probably 90% of the people watching that episode were also descended from Edward III.
Yeah.
And then people will say to you, but I don't have any royalty in my family. Yes, you do. You are descended from Charlemagne.
What I find odd, I mean, if people are born into this weird aristocratic world where they're taught that this is the way to behave is one thing, but it's people who aren't in that group who then feel that they have to look up to them.
Yes.
And I remember I lived in Australia for a long time and I came back about 25 years ago. And in Australia, they are much less worried about class. They're much more sort of just talk to you. I mean, there's wealth inequality, definitely, but there's very little class inequality. When I came back, there was a story about a couple of fraudsters who were going in, booking places at tables at nice restaurants, and they booked it saying, I'm Lord such and such. And they immediately get, freebies, credit, whatever, because they are Lord such and such. And it's like, why would you do that? Why would you think that makes you a more respectable person? There's another anecdote that when I was living in Bath, there was a Conservative councillor who was a Sir. And he went into like a little corner shop and there was quite a long queue and he tried to cut in. And he said, when he was told to go to the back of the queue, they said, don't you know who I am? Oh. And the guy said, yes, that's why I'm telling you to go to the back of the queue, which is my attitude. You shouldn't.
So this is the problem with monarchy. Yeah. And as long as it persists, you are never, ever going to have that kind of degree of equality within society, because people will always be brought up to believe that there are other people who are inherently better than them by pure dint of birth. And that should have been got away with 200 or 300 years ago.
It's an institution that doesn't believe in equality. It's not just an obstacle to it. It actually doesn't believe in it, and it believes that it must continue to continue this system, which includes the aristocracy, who are kind of the bulwark for the monarchy. If none of that was there, then the monarchy would be in more trouble. So they kind of sustain this whole sort of network of wealth and power and influence.
That's where my republicanism comes from too. I think it's so sad hearing about the you and the non-you language. I think it's just bullying, and it makes me so upset to think of. I imagine my ancestors who didn't have any money and wouldn't have had any...
Apart from the kings and queens.
Apart from, all my kings and queens ancestors. And just that they were being bullied from far away, in their own world. And it's so... And just brilliant, hardworking, hilarious, warm people being looked down upon by other people makes me so sad.
Yes.
But I was also going to suggest... or ask you what you thought about a plan that Graham and I were talking about in the cafe, because I was saying, since we know that everybody is related to these kings and queens, that Graham potentially could put in a claim to the throne, become king, and then declare that we're just going to do presidents, prorogue the monarchy, and then that would be it. That would be the Republic goal done.
Foolproof plan.
We thought it was foolproof. What do you think?
Yeah, no, it's a good plan, yeah.
Yeah, okay. We were on board. Great.
Yes, I mean, there were periods when they elected kings and queens as well. But everybody seems to forget, we talk about the Elector of Hanover and all these people. Everybody kind of forgets that there was a whole era.
Yeah.
Admittedly, they were being elected by other posh people who were also royals. But there was a period when we did that. Well, not we, but when that happened in Europe. And here. Yeah, if you go back far enough.
Yeah. I mean, I guess because there was a documentary that Tony Robinson made probably about 20 years ago now, where he suggested that the real king was an Australian farmer because he was directly descended from the Plantagenets. But he was ignoring the Glorious Revolution and the Act of Settlement and all the rest of it. But
we said that was like the Star Trek 2009, where you just, something different happens, and so obviously those things wouldn't have happened.
Too, where pretty much you've got the same setting but an entirely different cast.
Yeah, totally.
And worse
not mentioning
songs.
it.
Yeah,
I mean, it is that whole odd notion of these lineages. But as I said at the beginning about the monarchy being all fake, when you wrote fake history, how did you when you were thinking about it, was the monarchy there at the start, or and how did you pick out which bit? Because I think you focused on the bit about them not being German, which is an interesting point, which I often make myself for all sorts of reasons. But was there a particular reason why you picked that out and not something else?
I think once you pull at certain threads, you just expose the ridiculousness of the whole artifice, really. And that's why I picked on that one, because it's one of those things that people trot out all the time. Oh, of course. People who don't like the monarchy trot it out. All sorts of people trot it out. But it's complete nonsense. Yeah. Again, that's a classic example of a fake family saga, because you can latch on to one person in your family history and go, oh, we are like this. It's what I also call the conceit of we in the first book. Yeah. The notion that we do this, we behave like this is who we are. So the royal family are Germans. Well, that goes back to the Sophia Act of 1701, I think it was, which was basically when they ran out of people to be kings and queens after Queen Anne.
The Electress of Hanover,
And they said, okay, well, anybody descended from Sophia in Hanover, it has a right to be the monarch, because that's all we've got left. They reached a dead end. They basically reached a dead end in monarchy. And so this, again, the notion that there's an unbroken line. Well, there's a massive fault in the road where you've got a complete dead end and you have to go to somewhere else. And that's when we get George I coming over, because Sophia died before Anne outlived Sophia by a few months, I think. So then George I comes over. Well, George I, going back to truly terrible human beings, was a truly terrible human being. I mean, the guy basically, I mean, he didn't do it himself, but his wife, who was also confusingly called Sophia's lover, was murdered by George I's henchmen. And then she was banged up in prison for 30 years and forgotten about. And he came to England and carried on living with his mistresses.
Well, I was going to, we were going to do that. I was going to,
because we could say, pop over to Patreon, because now we're going to have a quick fire round about monarchs.
We thought we might do a quick fire round.
We'll do that.
Would that be all right?
Yeah. What, do it now?
I want to put you on the spot, make you really sweat.
I can't pretend to say that I know a lot about all of them, but I have my favourite ones I hate, which I'm happy to talk about. James I is a particular favourite.
I was going to say about this, I mean, you say it's a dead end when they picked up Sophie, but obviously it's a dead end because they didn't want Catholics. That was the blockage. And they said, definitely no Catholics, so they went all the way,
Why didn't they want Catholics?
Well, I mean, that basically Henry VIII and the Reformation, and I can't remember when the Act came in, but from henceforth, you couldn't have any Catholic monarchs. Although Mary I, who is a rare monarch that I actually quite like, and who features in my next book, although she did kill a lot of people, but Mary I is this kind of the rebel monarch, and I've got a bit of time for Mary I actually, because she basically single-handedly takes on the apparatus of the state and leads a revolt against it, which is a fairly impressive thing to do. Everything she did as queen was terrible.
But there was a lot of backwards.
But that moment when she stood up to be counted is quite an amazing moment.
From Henry VIII through to James II, there was a lot of backwards and forwards between Catholics and Protestants, but they were absolutely determined to make sure there was no Catholics after that.
Yeah.
So, and that's why when I think they were concerned about James II, which is part of the reason why they ditched him for William. But yeah, it's still on the books.
But he was also terrible, King James II.
It's still a rule. Still a rule. You were saying that you can't have a Catholic.
Whereas other constitutions might say things like, we the people. Our constitution says no Catholics, and the head of state will be the heir to a woman who lived in Dutch-born German who lived in Europe.
Yeah, and presumably lots of people are related to her as well, and therefore.
Yes, well, indeed, yeah.
I think George V wanted to marry a Catholic, and she was a commoner, which is about the only good thing about George V, actually.
Yeah.
But and they were told he couldn't, so he didn't.
saying they're Germans, though, this is a little bit bugbear of mine because it doesn't help, and it's not that different to suggesting that Rishi Sunak isn't English.
Absolutely.
It's not an argument that helps the cause.
No, it's appalling. And also, if you want to play that game, Nigel Farage is German.
Well, indeed, yeah.
Because his great-great-grandparents were German migrants on one side of his branch of his family. David Cameron is therefore German because he too is descended from a George or a William. Boris Johnson is there. It's ridiculous to say that you are this by dint of what your ancestors were 200 years ago. It's absolute nonsense.
Yeah. My ancestor, the guy who brought my last name to the UK, it was 200 years ago, and he was a mariner. Yeah. But I would not advise you both to get in a boat that I was steering.
Yeah.
Because we would all die. Can we ask you about, before we do that quickfire round then, the history of Republicans in the UK? Because, we feel like it's rarely taught or discussed, and yet there's a really rich history that's just as exciting as the history of monarchy.
That the so-called interregnum, i.e. when Cromwell becomes Lord Protector of the country for a decade and a half, largely ignored by everyone. Even the term interregnum suggests that it's a sort of intermission.
Yeah.
It's like, back in the 60s and 70s when they'd show very long films like Chitty Chitty Bang Bang and then they'd have popcorn in the middle. It's like the interregnum. It's like everyone sit down for a bit and then we'll sort out another king and then glorious Charles II will come back and we can all carry on with the Merry Monarch. And I mean, it's a really dicey area for a number of reasons. Firstly, because, of course, Cromwell commits heinous acts of violence in the conquest of Ireland. So if you stand up and say in Ireland that Cromwell had some redeeming features, I think you would understandably get shouted down by people because it was another violent war of attrition against a neighbouring country.
But it's interesting that gets picked out, and it was
atrocious. It does get picked out.
But the kings on either side of it, going way back, inflicted huge injustices against the Irish people and the whole world.
Absolutely true. Yeah. Cromwell did have some redeeming features, and that period is the birth of our modern parliamentary democracy. But most people don't understand that. Most people seem to think, and again, I'm making a massive generalisation by saying most people, but I'm going to keep saying it. Most people, I believe, seem to think that the monarchs somehow happily gave up all of these great powers. And we ended up with a happy ever after story in which, generous Queen Victoria and kind King William IV and everybody else kind of eased democracy along. The truth is complete opposite of that. They fought tooth and nail to hang on to their relevance and their power. Going back to the 17th century, when, of course, Charles I ended up having his head cut off.
And just as they do now. I mean, they continue to fight tooth and nail. It's just done very quietly, and they're fighting for their privileges and their wealth and
influence. And that through that power, yes. So Cromwell, I think, is a far more important figure than we give him credit for in this country.
But there's a richer history beyond that.
And there is a richer history.
So people like John Milton, and obviously Thomas Paine hugely influenced it.
So Milton got into huge trouble because during the interregnum, Milton was all in favour of it, and lots of people were. That's also forgotten. Lots of people were in favour of the Republic. Yeah. They were quite happy with it. Some people, as soon as the tide started shifting, and you can imagine it in modern politics, people who had been all in favour of it suddenly were like, "Oh dear, everything's."
Well, you see it.
Oh, I love the monarchy.
You see it in America now with Trump suddenly back, and everyone's sort of fawning over him and sort of watching their words. But what always amuses me when people debating it say, "Oh well, we got rid of it once, and we brought it back." It's like we didn't do anything.
No.
They reinvaded and staged a coup because Richard Cromwell was hopeless, and they kicked him out.
Yes, and that immediate period after the Restoration, again, most people think it sort of all eased smoothly back into place. It's not true. They went around hanging, drawing, and quartering people, and there was extreme violence. In fact, in my next book, Plug, it starts with a chapter set in the first month after the Restoration. And I had actually no idea until I researched and wrote that chapter, the amount of fear going on in England, because people had had 15 years of a fairly stable government and they suddenly panicked. They thought they were going to be routed. And
your book is called?
Notorious. Yeah.
Do you know when that's coming out?
May the 22nd.
And this is... I think I said before, it's kind of fake villains, is that?
Yeah, well, we don't say that. It's fake villains. No, it's Notorious is about bad people in history or perceived bad people, which actually is a really rich theme. I think it's a richer theme than the previous two books because there are bad people in history, like Vlad the Impaler, but there are people that we perceive to be bad because the narrative of history has been cast in the way that it has.
But Geoffrey Robertson, the lawyer, wrote Tyrannicide Brief about, I think, 15 years ago now, I think it was, and he spoke at one of our events and talked about when Charles II came back and royalists took power, they were rounding up the co-conspirators of Cromwell and executing them in the most horrific ways. But they were allowed their final words, and they were making these amazing speeches, which they were worried that they're going to stir the crowd up into a fresh revolution. Yeah. So they shipped them off to somewhere else to do it on the quiet. And that the legal cases around that set some legal precedents, which were then revisited with Guantanamo Bay.
Oh, really?
300 years later. So it was quite an interesting time of establishing certain...
They actually dug up some of the so-called traitors.
Yep.
Who had
Cromwell?
Well, not just Cromwell. They dug up. I think about 10 bodies and then executed them.
Interesting little factoid is that
Merry Monarch.
Richard Cromwell, until the Queen, the last late Queen, was the oldest living British head of state because he fled and lived in Europe. And
oh, really?
Yeah. There's a story about him visiting. He was dining with a prince or a king or someone, and they didn't know who he was, and he started railing against Richard Cromwell, and he just sort of kept quiet and enjoyed his stay and left. But yeah, he just lived fairly anonymously after that, but got away with it.
Running does make you live longer.
Yeah,
I mean but you see, that's really interesting because I don't think I know anything about him.
No, it's very little.
He's very much the Chris Jagger of history, isn't he? Mick Jagger's younger brother.
Yeah, he's sort of dismissed as the one that sort of let the whole side down and it was rubbish and hopeless and didn't know what to do. And I'm sure, like all of these stories, there's a lot more complex than that. But it was very obviously a counter-coup. It certainly wasn't restoring the monarchy.
So it's interesting. It's interesting what you were talking about creating narratives, and that the monarchy, people let them get away with stuff because that's our narrative as a country. And I remember reading Graham's book for the first time and thinking that it was really hopeful because it told this story about what Britain could be without a monarchy. And I found that, I was already a Republican, but I found that very persuasive.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, do you think that fake history, how do you think fake history affects our identity as a people? Does it make us lose our kind of true north of who we are?
I mean, even saying who are we is a complex one, isn't it? Because there are 65 million people in this country.
Yeah.
So the whole conceit of, I mean, once you start pulling at the threads, you could pull the whole thing apart. But again, it goes back to the conceit of we stand up against tyranny in this country. We stood alone against Hitler. We did this, we did that. We tell these self-reinforcing stories until we believe a sort of certain notions about ourselves. We saw it very much during the pandemic. We as a nation are somehow have magic blood and blitz spirit, and we will somehow get through this in a way that other people don't. I think when you look at Ukraine now, for example, you see that maybe that magic blood happens in a lot of places that are under assault, and that it's human spirit.
Yeah.
And so I think we're focusing a lot more on human spirit and human beings getting on with each other and breaking down the boundaries, whether those are societal boundaries or the boundaries of nations or the artificial boundaries that are put up to keep us apart. That's, I think, a good path forward, and a good way to start in this country would be to get rid of some of these institutions and just sort of reinvent this country and make it fit for purpose in the 21st century, rather than lingering on with these sort of Hogwartian, creaking, mechanisms which have guided us all these years, a lot of which is made up and artificial.
I wonder whether this is a good moment for, Graham, your quick fire round.
Very quick fire. We just mentioned some monarchs, and just tell us.
If I get it wrong, just cut it out.
One or two things that maybe is not what people think.
Yeah,
of. Okay.
Just like short phrases, if possible.
They'll jump around a little bit, but William the Conqueror.
I mean, William the Conqueror invaded England because he thought he had some divine right to be the King of England. On his coronation day, 25th of December, 1066, due to a misunderstanding over language, when everybody cheered hurrah for the king, he ordered that his soldiers went out and massacred everybody.
Wow. And an overreaction.
Now, you do get that as a sort of footnote in the Ladybird book of William the Conqueror. But again, the notion that this sort of man came over, Harold got an arrow in his eye, and like we all lived happily ever after, belies the fact that he was he was taking power through force, overthrowing the old order, imposing his own language on it.
And massacre people in the north of England, I believe.
Massacre people in the north of England. The Doomsday Book is really about him working out what he's just pinched.
Yeah. Indeed. Yeah.
We all go, oh, it's an amazing document, that. What a record of life. Yeah, it's just like him totting up what he's stolen off everybody. Yeah.
So, Queen Anne.
Queen Anne, I feel a bit sorry for Queen Anne. Queen Anne had all those children and they all died, and she was expected to provide a monarch, and was just a sort of quiet lady who didn't really do much and then died and sort of got largely forgotten. You might know more.
No, not really.
Queen Anne is one of those regnant monarchs who just had a lot of children and they all died.
But nothing really she wasn't there for that long, was she? I can't remember.
No, I mean, don't say...
Too sad. Next.
It is sad,
move on.
Yeah.
Charles II.
Charles II, the merry monarch, who comes back in glory and loves cocker spaniels, and who was a sort of... I mean, it's, the trouble with this story is people quite like hedonistic people because they like rock and rollers. So, but, he was the sort of Jim Morrison of monarchy, but without the songs. So he goes around sleeping with anybody he goes near. It is an extremely hedonistic human being who didn't do anything good for this country.
And of course, as we've already discussed, slaughtered lots of people on his return to the throne.
And slaughtered lots of people on his return to the throne and had bodies dug up and executed. If you read the histories of Charles II, people say opinion is divided. That's another one of my favourites. Opinion is divided.
That's shorthand for scumbag.
Opinion is divided between people who want to prop up the monarchy, who therefore have to excuse appalling people like Charles II, and the people who've actually dug into it is that go, he was an appalling man.
Yeah.
Or the people who were slaughtered by him.
All the people who were slaughtered by him, yeah.
We don't poll them. But I feel like they'd all swing one way.
But the other thing is we don't know what ordinary people thought of Charles II because none of them wrote anything about him. Because
and
people
who would have
said? Yeah.
Who would have said at that time, out of fear for being killed? You know, you would have to have some.
And if you
stones.
read, philosophy and other, literature and so on during those sorts of ages, you read the sort of backstory, you know that they have one eye to whether they're going to get in trouble. So
yes,
these people will always make room for the monarch if they think that that's good for their life chances or their survival.
Charles II is another one who they say he went among the people and whatever.
Yeah.
I don't know whether there's actual evidence for that. But also, who cares? Well, the rest of us are all walking around the streets.
Yeah.
Why is it magical? Is he Jesus? Is he, coming down to walk among us? Aren't we lucky?
What about King John?
King John, again, is someone you can feel a little bit sorry for, but you're going way back there. And also, he's all of our ancestor, so we have to be careful about Grandad. King John's profligate brother goes out and spends everything on the Crusades. I mean, that is broadly true. He then is obliged to raise taxes for people. And then has his comeuppance. I mean, again, Magna Carta.
Yeah.
Everybody goes, that's a marvellous thing, Magna Carta. Really, Magna Carta is just the sort of barons trying to seal their own rights.
Which John then ripped up anyway.
Which he ripped up anyway.
They kept on bringing it back and tearing it up.
Yeah,
and, so there's not much of it left in force now. But I mean, it was a very odd.
Interestingly, there was no other John in the family between him and Prince John, who was terrible George V's youngest son, because they considered that they're also very superstitious, the royal family, and poor young Prince John had a tragic end. He died very prematurely. Yeah.
Although this is why they always predicted that Charles would change his name to George when he became king, but didn't.
Yes.
But I think that's because the age, we've reached an age when people wouldn't really accept that. They just keep calling him Charles. They probably decided it wasn't worth
George VII
going down that road. Talking about George, is George the Fourth? I think you mentioned him in your book.
I mean, George IV is an appalling person. George IV is an appalling person, even by the, let's return to that phrase, even by the standards of his day. He was the one
who was the regent before he became the king.
Yes, he was the regent. Appalling, again, another hedonistic, terrible figure, but who was also very grand. So George IV thought that he was sort of, thought that by dint of being king, all the wars that were being waged under him were his, were down to him, and he was an extremely self-important man who spent huge sums of money which he didn't have and was permanently broke. James I, let's talk about him.
Go for it.
James I, James VI of Scotland, is, again, everybody knows the story of how his mother, Mary Queen of Scots, was executed at Fotheringhay and how he then, some years later, became King of England, separate to being King of Scotland. James I was an absolute barmy stick, if there is such a word. And it's down to him, really, that the witch hunts of the 17th century happened, because the guy was incredibly paranoid and came to believe that a journey to go and meet his wife, Anne of Denmark, when they were first betrothed, had been cursed by witches in Copenhagen and back in Scotland, and that had whipped up a storm. There was this massive tempest in the North Sea that went on for a year, and which inspired William Shakespeare's Tempest and the opening scenes in Macbeth. And as a result, James became, I mean, if he was a social media influencer, he would be in Ike territory. He believed that there were witches everywhere, and that they needed to be, the conspiracy theorists, that they needed to be exterminated and executed. Yeah. He was responsible pretty much directly for the murder of thousands of women, largely women. And yet, people, lovely James I. Yeah.
Finish on one very quick one, which is my personal bugbear, which is Victoria. Because she is, again, she's elevated to this sort of greatness. And she strikes me as someone who is, like most of them are, deeply self-centered. And as you sort of allude to in your book, went off on this very indulgent, however many years it was, of mourning.
Wasn't really interested in being queen.
No, but also was, certainly wanted, titles like Empress of India, very much pro empire and all that kind of thing. One of the oddities is kind of the last era. I suppose we sort of talk about the Edwardians, but if we could talk about the Victorian era. We talk about this whole documentaries. What did the Victorians do for us? Which is quite odd because it's a very long period. Yes. It's like connecting the people of the 1950s with the people of the 2010s. But
this is the ladybird territory again. You see, we define our history by monarchs.
Yeah,
that's really unhealthy. How you will ever change that, I don't know. But if you entirely look at the nation's history, the history of England in particular, through the prism of monarchy, they become so entrenched in the fabric of the history and the fabric of our life that you can't ever really quite shift it.
Yeah.
And I mean, again, some of these people are truly appalling. Some of them are just victims of birth. So Victoria is somebody who ends up being monarch because she's born into it. But yeah, I mean, she didn't do much.
No.
And she didn't believe things like poverty really existed. And because she was an aristocratic woman, totally removed from society. And that's another huge argument for a republic, because these people are so out of touch.
Yeah.
There's this line that gets trotted out all the time, all politicians are the same. They're not all the same. None of us are the same. But people who are that far removed from ordinary life, who, if they have bothered to educate their children at all, have sent them through the most expensive educational systems in the country and remain in an elite, they have no idea what ordinary life is, or what it is to go shopping, or to worry about when your next bill is going to be paid and all of that stuff. And I do think that as we reimagine and reinvent Britain for the modern age, having people in charge who actually have some, of course, we can't understand everybody because we all have unique experiences, to have some sort of understanding of what it is to live in this country and be an ordinary person is a much better head of state than somebody who's lived in a little sort of gilded cup.
Cool, thank you so much. That was great, wasn't
really
it?
Good.
Was it good?
Yeah.
Really good chat.
Really, really good. We've overrun, so it must be good.
Okay.
So, But thank you.
Well, thank you for having me.
If I'm to go, I'm just going slightly meta here, but I think that chat was a really good primer for everything else we're going to talk about on the podcast. And it's a really good introduction for people to republicanism. And it's also something that I think about a lot, is I'm a Republican because I'm anti-hierarchy. So I have to be. But then the other thing I think about is all the butchery for hundreds of years, and why on earth we would then be like, isn't that wonderful?
Yeah. And I think this is what, because it's not, our chat with Andrew wasn't about, the Constitution and the nuts and bolts of how we govern and what we're doing now. It's just about that sort of more sort of fundamental sense of, right and wrong and who these people are and honesty about their history and that sort of thing. And I think that, because very often people say, they're symbolic. And I just say, well, of what? Because what they're symbolic of is that butchery and that gangsterism.
Yeah. And it's about narratives, isn't it? And I really, as a writer myself, that's something that I've always been really interested in. What are the cultural narratives? Why they're there? what's going on really.
And I think this is where when we see people who are strong royalists, they've got such that link between their personal identity, their notion of what Britain is and the royals is what we are, in their eyes, undoing. We're pulling the threads of that, and they get quite upset about it, which, it's understandable if that's where they are coming from. And I suppose in a sense it might be, if you are moving from that to being a Republican, which does happen, it's a little bit like losing your faith, because it's such a big sort of transition to a different way of looking at the world around you. But I think this whole notion of the fakery, I said at the start of the chat with Andrew that, the monarchy is all about smoke and mirrors and about telling a lie about this one family, and just the very notion that they're connected back through history to this family, and that is somehow a good thing, when they're just an awful bunch of people.
Yeah, and like all the kind of Wikipedia and the narratives online about Henry V, without questioning whether it's a good thing, they talk about him expanding Britain and being a sort of all these successes on the battlefield. But obviously what you're talking about is that he killed many people, some by his own hand. Yeah. And you just think this is bonkers.
And not for the benefit of the people that live there.
No.
In all this exchange of land. And I read a fair bit about the sort of the late Roman Republic and the Roman, early Roman Empire. And there's a lot of sort of generals getting land, and through land you have wealth, and then through wealth you have power. And it seems like that's the kind of the early establishment of linking power and land that then becomes a source of conflict. As the land runs out, you start to fight over it. And then with the spread of Christianity and the popes and Charlemagne and people like that, they start attaching a religious element to it. So, and as the years go on, they start saying, well, because my granddad was married to your grandmother or whatever 100 years ago, I have that piece of land is mine.
Yeah.
And it's just a very, very cynical way of grabbing more land, which is a source of money because they take money off the land.
And I think Andrew/Otto also wrote about how these early kings, when they were wandering around waging these wars, they were quite into looting. And it was so interesting for me to read that chapter about Henry V and fake heroes, because I didn't realise he was so young. So often they're portrayed as much older men and sort of august and kind of these distinguished and serious people who are making military decisions. But really in the book and reading about the actions he took, it sounded like somebody who was in his 20s for the majority of the fighting he did, was looting everywhere.
I guess there's quite a lot of people, barons and lords who will also profit from that.
Yeah.
And so they expect the king to do that as well. So there's a lot of expectation that this is what kings do because we all profit. But it's still that very small number of people, probably in the hundreds, who in a population of, 1 million people or whatever it was in England at the time, they are dictating everything. They're rounding people up and saying, you're going to be in the army, and if people in their own territory don't approve of what they're doing, don't agree, then they get slaughtered as well.
And obviously the early kings, and this is how we eventually ended up with the line that we have, it wasn't like, you become king, as you were saying, that the barons all expect this of you, so you go and do that and you do very well and you remain king and then your son is king. It was, if you're not good at that, if you're not the most murderous barbarian out there, then you don't get to be king. You get killed by somebody and someone else takes the throne.
Yeah. Okay, so that's all from us at the moment. Just a reminder that Andrew writes under the name of Otto English, Fake History, Fake Heroes, and on May 22nd, his new book, Notorious, will be out. So huge thank you to Andrew. Don't forget to check out our Patreon page, republic.org.uk/Patreon. You can find out more about Republic at republic.org.uk, where you can join, donate, and get involved. Bye for now.